that when it comes to, for example, food insecurity, school food programs, again, you can always pour money into any program and at the margins create change. I mean, there's no doubt that pouring money onto anything will create change in a marginal way. The question is, how large is the margin and how big is the movement, right? So the delta is what I'm looking at. And so I think that you're starting at a second order question, which is, what if we ignore what I would think are the big primary questions of education, namely family structure, value of education at home, how much you have parents who are capable or willing to help with homework. What are the incentive structures we can set up for a society that actually facilitate that? How local communities take ownership of their schools is a big one, right? All of these issues we're ignoring in favor of, say, air conditioning or lunch programs. And so in a vacuum, if you say air conditioning and lunch programs, sounds great in a vacuum. In terms of prioritization of values and cost structure, are those the things that I think are going to move the needle in a major way in terms of public policy? I do not. And in fact, I think that many of them end up being disproportionate wastes of money. I mean, I've talked before pretty controversially about the fact that an enormous amount of school lunch programs are thrown out. Like an enormous amount of that food ends up in the garbage can. Is there a better way to do that? If there is a better way to do it, then I'm perfectly willing to hear about that better way to do it. But it seems to me that one of the big flaws in the way that many people of the left approach government is, what if we hit every gnat with a hammer? And my question is, what if the gnat isn't even the problem? What if there is a much bigger substructure problem that needs to be solved in order to, if you're shifting deck chairs on the Titanic, sure, you can make the Titanic slightly more balanced because the deck chairs are slightly better oriented. But the real question is the water that's gaping into the Titanic, right?
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. But again, I feel like we're on the conservative merry-go-round then of never wanting to address
That's not a conservative merry-go-round. I can give you 10 ways.
Well, sure. But so here would be the merry-go-round. I would say that there is a minimum funding for schools that I think would help children. And then we go, well, the thing that would help them the most is two-parent households. And I go, okay, well, two-parent households actually aren't the problem. The issue is access to things like birth controls, that people don't have children early on. And it's but the issue isn't actually birth control. The issue is actually you need a certain amount of money to move out early and to get married and then to have a two-parent household. So it's actually economic opportunity.
No.
Well, it's not.
No, just two-parent households. That's it.
But what are the precursors?
Don't fuck people before you're married and have babies.
Sure.
Done.
That's great. We can say that and try to fight against, however many hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, but people will have sex and people will make babies.
And then they used to get married. The vast majority of people in this country with kids used to be married. The vast majority of people with kids in this country now are not married increasingly. That is obviously a societal change. Something changed. It wasn't human evolution.
But a lot of those things in terms of resting on whether or not people get married have to do with financial decisions. Do you have the money?
People are worse off now than they were 50, 60 years ago when the marriage rates were higher.
People are delaying the start of their careers because education is becoming increasingly important.
So in other words, people are richer now and they have more education now, and yet they're having more babies out of wedlock now because they're richer and have more education?
I'm saying that one of the biggest indicators for whether or not somebody's willing to get married is how much money both people are making if they can move out of their household. People don't tend to want to get married at 22 when they've just finished college, when they don't have the money to move out and they can't afford a house.
Because we have changed the moral status of marriage in the culture, meaning that everyone, poor, rich, and in between, used to get married. By the way, a huge percentage of marriages in the United States used to be what they would call shotgun marriages, meaning that somebody knocked somebody up, and because they did not want the baby to be born outside of a two-parent household, they would then get married.
Do we think that shotgun marriages, though, are a way to bring back equilibrium to education?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes, 100%.
Do we think
a child deserves a mother and a father?
Sure.
Because that is the basis for all of this, including education.
Do we think that shotgun marriages are, well, let's say this. Do we think that that's a reasonable direction that society would ever take? Or is this
Yes, it was the reasonable direction for nearly all of modern history.
But history moves in one direction, right?
Why?
Because of time?
I mean, people don't think that's in what way is that?
And I don't think we've ever regressed social standards back to let's go 100 years back and do things that used to exist before.
That's weird. The entire left right now is arguing that we regress social standards by rejecting Roe versus Wade. So that's obviously not true.
The Roe versus Wade is not a social standard; it's a Supreme Court ruling. Number one. Number two, if you read the actual majority opinion on Roe v. Wade, we can see that socially we actually never made huge progress on how society viewed abortion. This has always been an incredibly divisive thing, right? Even that was, I think, part of Alito's writing on it was that things like gay marriage, for instance, we've kind of moved past, and it's not really as debated anymore. But abortion was never a settled topic, despite Roe v. Wade.
The notion that the arc of history constantly moves in one direction is belied by nearly all of the 20th century.
What do we mean by that?
I mean,
in
the
terms
first
of
half of
women's
the 20th
rights,
century
civil
is filled
rights,
with barbarism, communism, Nazism. All of that was a regression from what was happening at, for example, the beginning of the 19th century and the 20th century.
In what way?
Nazism and communism weren't a regression from what was going on in 1905.
These are, in terms of communism being a regression, for instance, I'm not a communist, but the industrialization of the Soviet Union happened under a communist society. The industrialization.
So the murder of tens of millions of people.
Yeah,
I consider that a regression. A moral regression, which is what we are talking about now. Moral regression. And you're suggesting that moral regression, I wouldn't term a return to traditional values a moral regression. You would. But your suggestion is that history only moves in one direction. And I'm suggesting that history does not only move in one direction. It tends to move actually back and forth.
Sure. I don't think that all of history moves in one direction. There are going to be wars. There are going to be times of peace. I think in general, we're more peaceful now than we have been in the past. But I think when we look at the way that people live their lives, I think that we tend to move in a certain direction socially. So when it comes to things like racism, or when it comes to things like slavery or women's rights, I think that there are two huge things that probably aren't changing in the US. And one is access to contraception, and one is women working jobs. I think that these two things are probably huge things that are moving us off of shotgun marriages or getting married very early on. And I don't see those. Do you think that those two things are going to change fundamentally?
First of all, what the data tend to show is that actually more highly educated people, as you were saying, tend to get married more. So if the idea is that women getting an education somehow throws them off marriage, it's the opposite. Usually those women are not educated.
But those women aren't getting shotgun marriages. Those women aren't having children.
Yeah, but now you're shifting the topic. My topic was how to get more people married. And what I'm and then you suggested that higher levels of education are delaying marriage and making it less probable. And what I'm telling you, because this is what the data suggests, is that actually as you raise up the educational ladder, people tend to be married more than they are lower down on the educational ladder. If you're a high school graduate, you're less likely to be married than if you're a postdoc.
I agree with you, but that's because one of the biggest precursors to getting married is having like a level of economic stability. So as people get more educated, they obtain this economic stability, and then they're in a more comfortable position to explore more serious relationships.
There's another confound there. I mean, the confound is that people in stable marriages tend to be the children of stable marriages. And there's only one way to break that cycle, which is to create a stable marriage. And that is something that is in everyone's hands. Again, this notion that it is somehow an unbreakable, unshatterable barrier to get married and have kids, I don't understand where this is coming from. Why is that such a challenge?
I don't think it's unbreakable or unshatterable. The initial point was for school, if we can provide a minimum level of educational stuff for children, that'd probably be good. But when we retreat back to, well, it has to be the families that are fixed first, fixing families is a multivariate problem that has so many different...
I am fine. Within my local community, we all vote. Again, I've suggested that there's a difference between local community and federal. I'm fine with my local community voting for school lunches or air conditioning or whatever it is that we all agreed to do, because the more local you get, the more homogeneity you get in terms of interest and the more interest you have in your neighbors. All of that's fine. I'm part of a very, very solid community. In our community, we give to each other. We have minimum standards of helping one another. All of that's wonderful. When it comes to the actual problem of education, what I object to in the political sphere, and this happens all the time, is everybody is arguing on top of the iceberg about how we can move the needle 0.5 percentage points, as opposed to the entire iceberg melting beneath them. And we just ignore that. And we pretend that that's just, sort of the natural consequence of things. The arc of history suggests that people are never going to get married again. Actually, what the arc of history suggests, realistically speaking, is that the people who are not getting married are not going to be having kids. And what it also suggests, the people who are married are going to be having kids. And so the demographic profile actually over time is rather going to shift toward people who are having lots and lots of kids. I'm married. I have 4 kids. Everyone in my community is married. It's like minimum buy-in in my community is 4 kids. Okay. And so what's happening actually in terms of demographics is that the people who are more religious and getting married are having more kids. And so if you're talking about the arc of history shifting toward marriage, I would suggest that actually demographically over time, long periods of time, not over one generation, over long periods of time, the only cure for low birth rate is going to be the people who get married and have lots of kids.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with any of that, but I'm just saying that, again, I know you're upset when I bring up the term merry-go-round. I think that there are good conversations to be had about people getting married because stable families produce stable children that are less likely to commit crime, that are more likely to go to school, that are more likely to be productive members of society, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to disagree with you on any of that. All of that is true. It's just frustrating that sometimes when you bring up any problem, all of it will circle back to other things that makes it seem like we can't make any progress in any area without fixing something.
In what way? I mean, I literally just told you that on the local level, I'm fine for people voting for air conditioning.
Yeah, but so for instance, on the local level, so for school funding is done, I think, generally per district. So what do you do when you have poor districts that can't afford air conditioner for their schools?
I mean, the idea there would be that presumably if the society, meaning the state, and I generally don't mean the federal state, I mean like the state of California, for example, decides that everybody ought to have air conditioning, people will vote for air conditioning, and that's perfectly legal. And I don't think there's anything morally objectionable about that per se.
Cool.
I also don't think that that's going to heal anything remotely like the central problem. Sure, and I think that what tends to happen in terms of government is people love arguing about the problems that can be solved by opening a wallet, and nobody likes to solve a problem by, closing their sex life to one person, for example, or having kids within a stable religious community. Like the things that actually build society. I'm fine with arguing about each of these policies. And whether we apply them or not is a matter generally of pragmatism, not morality. It's a matter of incentive structures, not per se morality. Because incentive structures do have moral underpinnings. There's such a thing as, for example, if you're going to use a welfare program, you have to decide how effective it is, to what crowd it applies, where the cutoffs are. Does it disincentivize work? Does it not? All of these are pragmatic concerns. But on a moral level, the generalized objection that I have to people on the left side of the aisle is that they like to focus in these conversations. Very often it feels as though it's a conversation with people who are drunk searching under the lamp for their keys. The problems they want to look at are the problems that are solvable by government. And then all the problems they don't want to look at, which are the actual giant monsters lurking in the dark and not particularly solvable by government, are the ones they want to ignore and assume are just the natural state of things. And I don't think that's correct at all.
And I 1,000,000,000% agree. And then obviously my criticism for the conservative side is the exact opposite, where there are parts where government could remedy some issues. For instance, children having sex with each other and producing other children out of wedlock. Like sometimes having after-school programs is nice to prevent that. Like I didn't have time for these things when I was in school. I was doing football practice. I was doing cross-country practice. I went in early for a band, I agree with you that sometimes people only focus on one end of the problem. I hate to be that guy, but as somebody have you ever watched The Wire?
Sure.
I'm not going to cite The Wire as a real life example, but like obviously there's only so much you can do in a school when the children coming in are so beyond destroyed because of the family life and everything prior to them even getting to school that day. So I agree. Government is not like the solution to broken families. That would never be the case.
And it's actually not the solution to education, depending on the kind of solutions that you're talking about. Some solutions, yes. Some solutions, no.
Yeah. So the only thing I'm looking at is, as I said earlier, just like these minimum threshold things where it's like, where can government make? Because you mentioned marginal, which I think is a really good way to look at things. There's marginal cost and marginal utility to things where the first $1,000 per student you spend might give you a huge return, but the extra $20,000 after is just
I think these are all pragmatic discussions.
Sure, of course. Okay.
Actually, this is what we used to hash out in legislatures before they turned into platforms for people grandstanding. But yes.
Sure. Okay, yeah.